Love blinds a man, but what blinds a mother? Maybe it's trusting the wrong woman with her son's life. I'm Mavis Ellis, South End born and church raised, the kind of mother who keeps a ledger in her head, debts, mercies, the little promises people make with their eyes when their mouths go quiet. On my son Trent's 30th birthday, I showed up unannounced with a chocolate cake, my best friend Nola Boone at my side, and a prayer tucked under my tongue. The rain over Seattle had that thin, ash-colored shimmer that makes porches look like wetted stone. Trent opened the door, and my heart did a stutter I couldn't hide. His hug was paper. His eyes were river stones. My boy smelled like cedar and metal, like he had been living inside a hospital brochure. "Mom? Nola? What are you doing here?" he asked. Behind him, Risa, my daughter-in-law with a voice built from temperature control, smiled and said we should keep it low-key because Trent wasn't feeling great, which is why I placed the cake on the counter like a declaration of care and said we'd handle dinner. Nola flowed to the kitchen the way a pharmacist flows to labels. She opened a cabinet and hummed at the alphabetic neatness, turmeric to valerian, each jar soldier straight, amber bottles nested in a tray like a kit. It took one unmarked vial to tilt the room. Clear glass. Stopper. No label. Nola held it by the neck, not touching the bulb, the way you hold a thing that has meaning and teeth. "What's this?" I asked too loud. Risa laughed a little breathless and called it espresso cleaner we'd never heard of. I watched her eyes, counted her blinks, traced the small muscle in her jaw that twitched like a telegram. We insisted on taking Trent to the family doctor. Risa insisted on managing his supplements. The doctor looked at my son's chart, looked at his color, and then looked at me like mothers are still triage even when our children have mortgages. Tests were ordered. Blood left his arm in tubes the color of danger. I held his hand and listened to the rain crank up over the parking lot, that old rhythm that makes you remember hymns. Driving home, the vial sat in my mind as if I had swallowed it. I thought of the South End kitchens I grew up in, where medicine was tea and thyme and grandmothers watching you swallow both. I thought of the ledger I keep and how some entries write themselves in red. I should have gone home and baked another cake. Instead, I went back to Trent's house with Nola because a mother knows when something is wrong, and sometimes the only way forward is through someone else's kitchen. When we got there, the lights were too bright, the counters too clean, and the tea kettle already singing. Risa smiled at me with her mouth. "I've got his routine," she said. "Stress can look like anything. So can harm," I said. She didn't flinch. The kettle clicked off. The steam pulled itself into the ceiling, and I realized this wasn't about manners. It was about proof. I didn't yet know how to prove what my body already believed, but I knew curiosity is a rope. Pull it, feel what gives. So I asked to see the teas again. Risa told me no, and Trent coughed from the living room, and Nola's eyebrows made a small roof over her eyes like she was sheltering a thought. I tucked the moment into my ledger and made us dinner anyway. On the plate, the salmon flaked right. At the table, the conversation didn't. And before I left, I said to Trent, quietly, "Let me come by tomorrow. We'll go for a drive." He nodded, unsure. Risa squeezed my shoulder, gentle as a leash. I smiled back like a woman who didn't just see a vial that didn't belong where love was supposed to live. The hook was set. What I needed next was a line strong enough to pull. The lab called the next afternoon with a voice like winter. His potassium is low. Liver enzymes off. Trace compounds we don't expect. The doctor didn't say poison. He didn't have to. I've sat in enough waiting rooms to recognize the dance around ugly words. When I hung up, I walked to my sink, ran the tap, and watched the water braid itself into clarity. Nola perched at my table with a little scale and a magnifier, parsing memory against chemistry. "We need samples," she said, "not feelings." Feelings are what taught me to survive the South End in the 90s. You learn the temperature of a room at the door. You learn who holds the knives. But numbers close mouths. So we drove back to Trent's and asked for a cup of tea. Risa obliged with a politeness that could slice paper. While water heated, Nola asked casual questions about blends. I watched Risa's hands. They know the order of things. They put sweetness where bitterness lives. Trent slept on the sofa, that thin afternoon sleep that belongs to the very young or the very harmed. Risa pulled down tins and talked about chamomile and ashwagandha and how Seattle wellness culture saved her sanity. She said the word protocol like she owned it. Nola nodded, reached for jars, and palmed a small piece of pH paper into her sleeve. When the mug reached me, I didn't sip. I dipped the strip. It bloomed a color that didn't belong to tea. "I'm switching Trent's vitamins." I said, "I'll bring my own from the co-op." Risa's smile lived and died in one breath. "I manage his meds. He forgets. He remembers being my son." I said, "That counts." We said a lot of polite things then that weren't polite. I touched Trent's forehead and told him I'd be back with soup, and I left with more than I came for. A napkin with a ring of tea and a memory of Risa's knuckles going white for 1 second when I moved the amber tray. At home, Nola lined up test strips and a cheap assay kit no one would think could tell a story. It can, if you know how to read. "Low dose," repeated, she said hours later, tapping the kitchen table where we'd set a map of the last 6 months. Dates, symptoms, the sudden gluten sensitivity, the gut complaints, the incremental fatigue. I drew a line through the dates. Trent canceled Sunday dinner. It looked like a slope into a hole. Why? I asked the ceiling. People harm for money, for freedom, for the pleasure of control. Risa had a good job, a tidy townhouse, a marriage to a man who wanted to love her. My ledger formed its shape, not a windfall, but an exit route that made her the author of the ending. Slow harm looks like illness. Illness ends marriages. Illness ends men. I slept badly and dreamed of my mother's hands sorting beans on a tray, flicking out stones. Morning made everything look more honest. I packed soup and drove to Trent's with a smile that I had to pin in place. Today, I would ask to take him out for a drive. Today, I would see what he said with Risa out of earshot. Today, I would start building a case, so clean it could live in the light. But when I rang, Risa opened the door with her coat already on and a toad on her shoulder. "Therapy," she said. "Couples. We're late." Trent looked at me like a child caught between parents at a crosswalk. "Tomorrow," he asked. "Tomorrow," I said, and as they passed me on the stoop, I noticed the tote said, "Real revenge isn't fireworks. It's filing. You inventory, you timestamp, you build a chain that can't be snapped by a practiced liar with a pretty face." I spent the morning at my dining room table with a notebook and patience, listing what I'd need without adding new people to the mess. Labels, freezer bags, a cheap camera, A new kettle that lived at my house, vitamins from a store I could vouch for. Risa liked control. Fine. I would teach her what control looked like when it wore paper and ink. Nola and I returned to Trent's under the pretense of reorganizing the pantry. We want to help, I said. Let us stock you up. Risa looked at the paper towels in my arms like they were a weapon. I've got a system. You sure do, I said, and smiled so wide I felt it in my molars. We worked quiet and efficient. I asked for a step stool. From the top shelf, I brought down a tin with a loose lid and a smell like rain on copper. I didn't open it all the way. I didn't need to. I slipped it into a bag I'd already labeled with date and time, then set a matching, harmless tin in its place. Same dent, same dust ring. Curiosity loop closed. Another opened. I replaced the kettle with my own and told Trent I wanted him to drink only what I brewed for a week. Doctor's orders. I lied with a straight face that motherhood taught me. He laughed weakly and then coughed until he folded in half. Risa hovered with a hand on his back, slow circles, her face the portrait of concern. When she looked up at me, a flicker of something else skipped across her mouth. Not fear. Annoyance. The kind people feel when a plan is interfered with. Back home, Nola tested the tin's residue. It wasn't something a person would recognize from a crime show. That's the thing about slow harm. It lives in the cracks of regulation, herbs that change when heated with certain minerals, compounds that look like wellness until you stack the doses. There's a marker, Nola said, inert to Trent, visible to a say. We'll swap it into your kettle. If the kettle in their house shows the marker next week, we know someone poured from yours into theirs when you weren't around. Why would she? I asked. To maintain the routine. To stay in charge. Nola said. Control is a habit. I didn't call the police. I didn't scream at Risa in the driveway. I sat with Trent and talked about the hiking trail we used to take near Seward Park, about the way the lake flattened into pewter when the clouds got heavy, about the first time he coded something that made him forget to eat. I told him that love can be a pot that boils you if you don't watch it. He smiled the smile of a man triangulating his life from the couch cushions. You think I'm in trouble, he said. I think you're loved, I said. And I think someone is making you smaller, so they don't have to grow. When we left that night, I placed my kettle, marked and harmless, on their counter with a note that said, use this one, heats faster. The other kettle went home with me, bagged and labeled, joining the tin and the napkin ring stain. I didn't have an end game yet. I had process. Process is how we beat people who think subtlety is a shield. I slept with the lights low and my phone face up. I dreamed of chains, necklaces, bicycle locks, the metal sound of custody. In the morning, I would go back and cook breakfast. In the evening, I would log what the marker revealed. Between those bookends lived a question with teeth. When a woman loves control more than a man, what happens when control is taken from her hand? Before you take a woman to court, you take yourself to memory. I sat with coffee and the box of wedding programs and old text threads I pretend I don't keep. I scrolled back to the first time Risa came to dinner. The way she asked Trent's opinions like they were slips she intended to fold, the way she complimented my greens, and then asked if I'd considered steaming instead of braising for the nutrients. I remembered how Trent started saying we for things he used to say, I about, and how the we compensated for a steadiness he seemed to be bartering away. In our part of Seattle, Black women are accused of being loud when we're accurate. I have learned to speak in receipts. I pulled bank statements out of my file box, not to find fraud, but to see patterns. The wellness shop that became a weekly line item, the subscription for lab tests done at home, the seminar Risa attended called Resilience Through Routine. If you listen close, you could hear the motive breathing. Risa didn't want Trent dead. She wanted him dim. Nola came by with a bakery bag, and her sleeves rolled. We listed incidents alongside lab values. The afternoon's light turned pewter. "You're building a case," she said, "and you're telling yourself a story that keeps you from burning it all down." Both were true. My revenge had to be legal and clean. Not because I'm holier than anybody, but because anything else would give Risa the out she was writing for herself. Hysterical mother, interfering Black woman, overbearing church lady who can't cut the cord. I called the family doctor and asked to add a note to Trent's chart. Request direct communication with patient's mother for care coordination. Patient consents. Trent consented while half asleep, voice thick, the way sons do when they remember you held them through fevers. I hated myself a little and wrote that feeling down so I could carry it honestly. Manipulation isn't always evil. Sometimes it's the only bridge left across a river someone else dynamited. We drove to the lake at dusk. Trent leaned his head on the window and watched Seattle turn its lamps on. I told him about my own marriage, the part nobody sees, the year I stayed in the house with a man who used silence like a face cloth, cooling everything until I couldn't remember my shape. Control can wear kindness, I said. It can smell like eucalyptus and sound like a meditation app, but it still puts you on a schedule you didn't make. He closed his eyes and said nothing for a long time. Then, "I'm scared, Ma." "Me too," I said. "That's how I know we're telling the truth." At home, I checked the kettle I bagged. The residue told a story. Enough of the marker appeared in their used kettle to suggest transfer, which meant someone moved liquid the day after I switched them, which meant habit was stronger than caution. I labeled the bag and slid it into the freezer next to last summer's berries, a small, ordinary shrine to the faith that systems work when you feed them. Tomorrow I would push. Not yelling, not threats. Paper. The next chapter of this story would be a letter in a tone nobody can mistake, calm, precise, and sharp enough to cut the veil between care and control. People underestimate letters because they're quiet. I wrote mine at the kitchen table where my mother used to braid my hair tight enough to remind me my head belonged to me. "Risa," it began, "for the sake of Trent's health, I'm standardizing his intake. Effective immediately, no supplements, teas, or dietary changes unless ordered by the physician and documented in his chart. All beverages will be prepared in my presence with items I supply. Any deviation, and I will notify Adult Protective Services." I printed it, signed in blue ink, and placed it on their counter next to the kettle that wasn't hers anymore. Risa read it standing, arms crossed, chin lifted, a posture that says negotiation when her eyes said war. "You're overstepping," she said. "I'm his wife." "You're his wife," I said. "I'm his mother. Only one of us brought him into this world. Both of us want him in it." She smirked at the implied algebra. "And you think calling agencies helps Black men?" she asked. The question hung like smoke. "I think documenting harm helps everyone," I said. "Even the person doing the harm, if they remember who they are in time." Trent walked in on the last line, sleep must, and trying to triangulate the air. What's going on? Boundaries, I said. Bureaucracy, Risa said. He looked at me with that old boy I raised still living behind his adult face. Mom, no tea, I said gently. Soup. He took the bowl like a sacrament and sat. When he finished, he breathed easier. I didn't imagine it. I refused to. That evening, I photographed the letter where it lay and emailed a copy to my own address, to Nola's, to a folder labeled ledger that lived in the cloud. I wrote a short chronology and attached the lab notes. I made no accusations. I wrote in neutrals and dates. Legal revenge moves like water around rock, not like a hammer. Risa went quiet for 2 days. Quiet has a texture you can touch if you grew up in my part of town. It's the air before a storm, the precise absence of certain noises. No blender, no kettle, no clink of amber bottles. On day 3, I found a new brand of vitamins on the counter with a receipt to indicate transparency. I took a photo. I also found the unmarked vial moved from behind flour to behind rice. I didn't touch it. I noted the time. When people say trust the process, they rarely add and be willing to let it break your heart. I drove home along Rainier Avenue as the sky did that Seattle trick of pretending to be silver. I thought about the ledger I keep, how it records both harm and grace. And I asked my mother in the quiet to keep my hands from doing something I couldn't sign my name to. Then I parked, went inside, and began drafting the next thing a woman like me does when a woman like her won't stop. An affidavit. Not for court yet. For clarity. For the next time anyone made me choose between my son's comfort and his life, the affidavit would need one more thing to be undeniable. Not a confession. A pattern anyone could see. So the next day, I changed my routine on purpose. I told Risa I had a church committee meeting and wouldn't stop by. Then I drove around the block and watched the kitchen window from my car, rain ticking time. People do what they do when they think no one is measuring. At 5:42, the kettle steamed. At 5:44, a cup lifted. At 5:49, Trent coughed into his sleeve. At 5:53, Risa washed a small glass vial and shook it dry. My pen moved by itself. The ledger wrote the line. Tomorrow, I would stop writing and start speaking. Not to her. To systems that think black mothers are noise. I would make them hear me as signal. You don't dial numbers like these without tasting bile. I called Adult Protective Services from my kitchen. Documents spread like a paper garden. I kept my voice steady and low, the way we learn to talk when authority has the power to mistake our urgency for aggression. I gave dates, symptoms, what the test showed, what the kettle revealed. I did not say Risa's name like an accusation. I said it like a fact placed gently on a table. They asked questions, and I answered. They said someone would follow up. I hung up and felt the small collapse a body does when it's been holding itself like a bridge. Nola poured coffee without comment, set a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Now we wait." Waiting is its own skill. In the South End, we learn to wait for buses that don't come on time, for opportunities that skip our block, for apologies that never arrive. But this wasn't passive. This was coiled. Risa called that evening. "You reported me." Not a question. I reported a situation. I said, "You want Trent sick. I want him well without you in charge." I said. The silence that followed was a mirror. You learn things about people in what they don't fill it with. You're going to end our marriage, she finally said. I'm going to end the harm. I said, if your marriage depends on that harm, it already ended. The follow-up came in two parts, a visit and a request for documents. I complied like a woman who has been preparing for a test her whole life. Trent, bless him, tried to finesse his way through it with jokes and softness. Risa performed concern with precision. I watched the official eyes look at my son's skin, at the way he moved slow like his joints had been taught a new alphabet. I watched them take notes and say they'd be in touch. I kept my hands still in my lap and didn't chew the inside of my cheek like I wanted to. That night, Trent texted me, "Are you sure?" I typed and deleted 3 different mothers before I answered. "Yes," I wrote. "Are you?" The dots flashed and disappeared. He called instead. "I love her," he said. "I believe you," I said. "Both can be true." He cried then, the quiet kind, the kind men think makes them less men and more trouble. "I don't know how to leave," he whispered. "Then don't leave," I said. "Just stop swallowing what's handed to you." In bed, I stared at the ceiling fan and thought about revenge like a river. You can try to dam it with rage, but it'll find a way around, into, under. Better to make a channel. Better to let it turn wheels that grind harm into powder. The next would be a restraining order for the substances, not the woman. No unsupervised administration of consumables. The language would say, sterile as a lab. It would look ridiculous until you put it beside a vial with no label. Paper moves slow. People don't. The next morning, Risa showed up at my door with a smile that belonged to a woman selling something expensive. "Let's be reasonable," she said. I invited her in because a ledger keeps 2 columns, and I wanted to offer her a chance to choose the right one. "Tell me why?" I asked. "If I'm misreading, save me from myself." She looked at my walls, photos of Trent with his gap-toothed grin, of me in a choir robe, of my mother in a yellow dress. When her eyes came back to me, they were bare. "I like him better quiet," she said softly. "The world is loud enough." I poured her coffee. I did not drink. "Then I like him better loud," I said, "and I am louder than the world when I need to be." She set the cup down without sipping. "You're going to regret this," she said. I smiled with all my teeth. "I already regret ever trusting you. Everything else will feel like relief." She left. I wrote the conversation down while the coffee still steamed. Tomorrow, I would file the order. Tomorrow, I would turn the river into a line of black ink. Orders don't fix feelings. The judge's stamped signature on the paper felt both too much and not enough. Language about supervision and prohibitions and compliance that would make any decent person. Trent stood between us as if between 2 mirrors, shrinking with every reflection. "I need air," he said finally, and walked out to the small backyard that held a grill he no longer used. I followed. The sky was a pale lid. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Do what?" "Be a man to 2 women who want me to be different men." The truth of it cut, but the clean kind. "You don't have to be 2, I said. "Choose the one you are when you're not scared." He looked at his hands like they were songbooks in a language he used to know. That night, he slept at my house for the first time in years. He lay on the sofa where he used to sprawl across Saturday cartoons and let the South End rain talk him down. I watched him breathe the way mothers do, and I realized my revenge had already begun to work. Not the paperwork. The interruption. Harm hates interruption. It has to start over. It loses its momentum. It reveals itself when it tries to catch up. In the morning, Trent made eggs badly and told me he dreamed of the lake. Water kept rising, and I kept building small walls. He said, every wall made the water find a new way in. I didn't say, that's what control does. He knew. He showered, put on clean clothes, and said he'd swing by the house to pick up a few things while Risa was at work. When he returned, he had his laptop, a duffel, and a face that had seen a ghost. She left a note, he said, handing me a folded paper. In Risa's tidy script, make your choice. If you choose her, you lose me. Sometimes the most violent things are written in careful letters. We sat at the table with the note between us. Do you love her? I asked. Yes, he said without a beat. Do you love you with her? I asked. He closed his eyes and took a long time answering. No, the ledger clicked. Then choose you, I said. If she loves you, she'll learn how. If she loves control, she'll leave. Either way, you live. He texted Risa. He didn't use poetry. He said he needed a separation to get healthy. He said the order stands. He said he'd coordinate with the doctor and me for meals this week. The dots blinked and then stopped. No reply. Hours later, I drove him to pack more clothes. The house felt like a stage after the actors leave. Props right where they should be. Energy gone. On the counter, the amber tray sat empty. The unmarked vial was gone. My spine registered both relief and dread. Relief for the obvious. Dread for whatever doesn't leave traces. I took photos of emptiness. I wrote down where the emptiness lived. I noted that leaving the vial was both sloppy and careful at once. Sloppy because it broke the chain of routine, careful because it removed a piece of evidence that would have sung in a courtroom. That night I lay awake and realized this was the fracture before the quake. Tomorrow, pressure would find a new fault line. I would be ready, even if ready meant bracing every picture frame in my house. Revenge, when it's clean, isn't about making someone hurt. It's about making truth undeniable. Nola and I built a small device out of a baby monitor and a magnet, the kind of thing a South End kid learns to rig by watching Annie's fix what men don't show up for. We placed it in my kettle, the one Risa liked to pour from out of habit, even after the order. It would log temperature spikes and timestamps and transmit to my phone. Harmless. Legal. Precise. Trent returned to the house for a talk while I sat in my car under the kuzu green shade of a street tree, coffee going cold in the cup holder. He texted me the moment Risa stepped into the kitchen. The device pinged at 5:18, again at 5:21, again at 5:26. I wrote the times. I noted the cadence. The pattern made a picture in my head. Heat, pour, pause, pour again. The old routine persisting through the order like weeds through a crack. Control doesn't read court language. It reads muscle memory. After, Trent came to my car, looking hollowed and clear at once. She cried. He said, "She said I abandoned her. She said you hate her." "I don't hate her," I said. "I hate harm." He nodded like a man starting to hear the difference. He handed me a tea tin from the counter, the same brand but a new lot. She insisted we keep the routine. I bagged it, labeled it, placed it beside the others. The ledger had stopped being theoretical. It was a file you could weigh in your hands. That night, the monitor pinged again though nobody should have been boiling water. I checked the device log. Temperature spike at 10:13 p.m. Video clip saved. I watched on my phone as Risa, alone, lifted my kettle, poured into a cup, and then poured from that cup into a small glass bottle. She capped it with that careful twist I'd come to know. She didn't drink. She washed. She dried. She returned the kettle to its spot. The river had carved its own confession. I didn't send the clip to anyone yet. I slept on it because sleep has a way of sanding down what rage would sharpen too much. In the morning, I sent it to the APS contact with the log attached and to the doctor with a subject line that read simply, "New data, no interpretation." I CC'd Trent. I did not CC Risa, not out of cruelty, out of process. By afternoon, the doctor called to say a toxicology consult would review. That word, consult, felt like a hand extended across a table I wasn't allowed to sit at. Fine. Take the hand. Hold tight. In the meantime, the doctor said, no unsupervised consumables. We already have that order. I said, then reinforce it. He said, I drove to Trent's with a bag of groceries and a face that didn't give away victory. I cooked while Risa sat silent at the table. When I set Trent's bowl down, she reached for the salt and stopped at the last second, like a musician catching herself before the wrong note. My eyes met hers. I saw a woman who understood. Finally, that the ledger had pages she couldn't tear out. Tomorrow, interviews. Tomorrow, someone with a badge, but no name in this story would ask us questions whose answers we'd already written in ink. I would be there, not as the loud mother, but as the quiet historian of a harm that thought it could hide in tea. And still, I knew the story wasn't done. Harm is stubborn. It always writes one last twist for itself. Twists don't arrive from nowhere. They grow roots in the parts of the story we skim. The toxicology consult, the voice was young but sure, asked me to walk through the months before Christmas, before the stomach aches, before the fatigue. I talked about the wedding's second year, when Trent switched jobs, and Risa discovered wellness like it was a faith. I mentioned the seminar called Resilience Through Routine. Instructor, the voice asked, I didn't know. Syllabus, I didn't have. But Nola did. She'd flagged it months ago, when a patient ended up lightheaded and depleted on a stack of adaptogens that weren't supposed to interact. We didn't add new people to our story. We added a document, a PDF with a module about partner alignment through dietary gatekeeping. The language was careful, nothing illegal, everything about consent and mutual goals, but the subtext was control disguised as care. In the margins, Risa had highlighted phrases. We knew because Trent, sifting through old files, found the notes with her initials. My stomach felt like a fist unclenching and then clenching again. Why did you start? I asked Risa in my kitchen where she'd once sat as a guest. She stared at the magnet poetry on my fridge like the words might scramble into absolution. He runs hot, she said. He forgets to rest. I thought if I could build a routine strong enough, it would hold him. Hold or bind. I asked, what's the difference? She said without irony. I saw then that my enemy wasn't a villain from a movie. It was a woman whose fear taught her to domesticate another person's life until it lay down and played sick. The consult's second call came with longer words and shorter patience. We can't prove intent, the voice said, but we see a pattern consistent with iatrogenic harm from non-prescribed substances. Legal language for what I already knew, The river had flowed, but the law wants a photograph of the source, not just the delta. Document the improvements under your control, the voice said. If his labs normalize off her regimen, that's data. Revenge is a kind of science. You change one variable. You measure. So we measured. 2 weeks of my cooking, my kettle, my vitamins. Trent's color returned like a shy guest. His jokes found their pace again. He slept heavy, without naps stealing the day. Labs crept toward normal, numbers clicking back into their grooves. Every improvement was a small gavel. Every mouthful a vote. Risa watched from a distance she hated. The order made us roommates with boundaries. She tried apologies that were really arguments. She tried gifts that were really bribes. I wrote them all down. On a Sunday, Trent and I sat on the church steps after service while the choir warmed up inside. I don't put God into paperwork, but I ask him into rooms where decisions are made. What's my part in forgiving? Trent asked, voice like paper softening to cloth. Forgiveness doesn't mean return, I said. It means you stop letting what happened write the rest of your sentences. He nodded like a man who could finally hear the choir through the door. Tomorrow a decision, not mine, his. My revenge had never been to make Risa hurt. It was to make truth heavy enough that love had to respect its weight. And still, I felt the twist forming like weather you sense in your knees. The origin wasn't just Risa's seminar. It was older. It was mine, too. The part of me that believed care equals control. The ledger doesn't just hold other people's debts. It holds mine. We met in the small park where Trent learned to ride a bike, the one with the cracked basketball court, and a view of the lake if you stand on the bench. Risa arrived on time with a face that had practiced not breaking. Trent spoke before either of us did. I'm taking 3 months, he said. Separate places, separate routines. Therapy for me. If we reconcile, it'll be because I can say I again in a house without fear. He didn't look at me. He looked at the lake. That was right. I was a ledger, not a steering wheel. Risa nodded once like a gavel falling. And the order stays, he said. She swallowed. You're humiliating me. I'm saving me, he said, and the man I raised sounded like he'd found his own keys. She tried to hand him a small bag, vitamins, a tea she swore was harmless. He shook his head. No more swallowing what you hand me. The sentence tasted like the rest of his life. We walked away together, but separate, mother and son on parallel tracks that finally ran true. Back at my house, we ate stew and watched the rain make lace of the window. I feel like I went away and came back, he said. You did, I said. I kept your room warm. He laughed, the first honest laugh in months. Revenge, it turns out, sometimes sounds like your child laughing again. The next day, the twist arrived. Risa filed her own papers. The language accused me of interference that bordered on abuse, claimed I staged evidence, alleged I'd poisoned my own kettle to frame her. I read the words and felt the ground tilt. Good strategies are always vulnerable to bad faith. Nola squeezed my hand until my rings pressed little moons into my skin. This is what control does when it's cornered, she said. It calls truth a trap. I took a breath and did the only thing that ever saved me. I told the same story again, with better receipts. I compiled every timestamp, every lab, every image from the device in my kettle, every email to myself with the letter's photo embedded. Every recipe I'd cooked with ingredients listed and purchased on my card. I walked into a room without names in this story and laid it all out. I made no speeches. I made a record. Trent spoke too. He spoke about nausea and naps and the way the world got small around his edges. He spoke about the first week on my food when color came back like dawn. He didn't accuse either. He described. Description is a blade if you use it right. The person with the badge who asked the questions didn't look at me like noise this time. They looked like someone watching a film they couldn't dismiss as a mother's melodrama. After, I sat in my car and watched the lake again. South End clouds hung low. Kids played ball under a sky that couldn't decide. I thought about my ledger and the entries I would add tonight. Not a victory list. A list of things I won't do again. Assume a smile equals safety. Confuse routine with health. Let fear make me polite when I need to be precise. Tomorrow, we'd get a decision about the competing papers. Tomorrow, the story would either end up a knot or a line pulled clean. They called it a hearing like the word meant anyone listened. I wore my church dress because armor comes in fabrics, too. The room smelled like printer ink and tired carpet. I spoke only when asked. Risa spoke with the righteous indignation of a woman who believes she saved a man by making him smaller. The questions were clinical. The answers were numbers. The numbers were merciless. Do you have an explanation for the markers found in the used kettle? A pause. Do you contest the timestamps? Another pause. Do you dispute the lab improvements under Ms. Ellis's care? The pauses did their own speaking. Control stumbled under light. It doesn't like objective things. It prefers fog. The result wasn't dramatic. It was a stack of words that maintained the order, expanded the supervision to include all consumables, and recommended individual counseling for both parties. There were notes about caregiver overreach that bowed toward my role without indicting it, which is to say the room acknowledged what Black mothers know. We are asked to save and scold in the same breath. I took the paper, felt both relief and the hot sting of being studied, and walked out into a hallway that smelled like old dust and finished chapters. Risa brushed past me without looking up. In that second, I didn't feel victory. I felt grief for the marriage I had tried to respect, for the woman who confused quiet with love, for my own history with men who needed me to lower my voice to fit their rooms. No, Trent moved into a sublet down the street from me. He cooked eggs better. He walked around the lake. He went to therapy and came home with sentences that had more verbs than apologies. I stopped hovering and started listening. Revenge had turned into repair, and I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. Maybe it was tonight when we ate stew and he said, "I'm not going back," like a man choosing his own house key. Still, the story had one more edge. Papers stop hands, but not hearts. Risa texted late, an image of their wedding day, a sentence about betrayal, a threat couched as grief. I didn't respond. The ledger advised silence. The next move belonged to the woman who couldn't control our kitchen anymore. She would pick a new room. I would be ready to meet her there with light. Tomorrow, Trent would make a final decision about divorce filings. Tomorrow, I would open my hands and let the ledger hold the rest. But before sleep, I wrote one more entry under my own name. Stop mistaking vigilance for love. Start trusting the men you raised to choose themselves. Hooks don't only pull others along. Sometimes they pull us, too, into a life we thought we'd lost while we were busy saving someone else's. When harm loses one instrument, it tries another. The next week, Risa started a narrative campaign among mutual friends. Emails painted me as a manipulative matriarch, suggested Nola had professional conflicts, implied Trent's improvements were placebo. I found out when a woman from church forwarded me a message with a subject line that tried to sanctify gossip. I didn't answer. I archived. I took a slow breath and did what revenge requires. At its most unglamorous, I kept documenting outcomes. Trent's labs normalized. His boss sent a note about his code velocity returning. He ran 2 miles without stopping and texted me a picture of the lake, pewter under a break in the clouds. He laughed at my kitchen table and didn't cough. These are small miracles that don't trend online. These are the miracles I keep in my ledger. We met with a mediator because legal revenge prefers rooms where people look each other in the face. The mediator wasn't a character in my story. They were a function. The function was simple: structure. Risa insisted on shared routines as a term. Trent said, "No shared ingestion," and looked at me with a gratitude that felt like a benediction. The function wrote down the words. The words became options. Options became a draft agreement that would either be signed or turned into a petition. Either way, the river kept moving. That night, Risa showed up at Trent's sublet. She stood on the porch in a drizzle, face soft, voice softer. "I can change," she said. He didn't open the door. "So can I?" he said, "into someone who lives." She cried. He cried on the other side of the wood. I sat at my kitchen table a block away and prayed the kind of prayer Black women pray when we're tired, not for victory, not for vengeance, just for the strength to keep our mouths shut while the person we love learns how to save himself. In the morning, Trent forwarded me an email Risa sent him at 2:14 a.m. The subject line was a plea. The body was a confession by omission. "I like you compliant. I don't know how to love you loud." I filed it. I didn't read it twice. It was gasoline looking for a spark, and my house had already burned enough. Then the real countermove, a demand through counsel to return marital wellness equipment I had confiscated. My kettle, my labeled bags, my evidence. I smiled without humor. The ledger had anticipated this line and built a wall called chain of custody. I responded with a list and photos and a sentence that said, "Items preserved pending any litigation, available for neutral inspection." Control hates neutral rooms. It thrives in corners. I dragged it into the center and left it there. Tomorrow, signatures or filings. Tomorrow, the campaign would either collapse under its own contradictions or migrate to new ground. Either way, my task was the same. Keep the man I raised in a house with light and food and sentences that belong to him. Hooks don't always dangle from cliffs. Sometimes they sit on kitchen tables, holding us to our best decisions when our hearts want to run back to what we survived. Not all traps are ours. Some are laid by truth and sprung by the person running from it. 2 days after the mediator session, Risa posted a long thread online about medical gaslighting and family sabotage. She included a photo of a tea tin, cropped but not enough. The dent matched the harmless twin I'd placed months ago. The timestamp on the image metadata. She forgot to strip it, put the photo in a window when she claimed no contact. I didn't need to screenshot. Others did. Screenshots traveled like rain in Seattle, sudden, everywhere. Trent forwarded 3 messages from people who had seen the thread, and then scrolled his old posts about recovery, about runs around the lake under low skies. The contrast wrote its own caption. "You don't need to respond." I said, "Let the picture do the talking." For the first time since this began, I watched narrative move without me pushing. Revenge took a chair and let reputation walk around the room on its own feet. Risa texted me that night, "You win." There was no win. There was only a ledger balanced enough to pass an audit. I typed and deleted, then sent, "Choose help." No reply came. That silence sounded like the end of a drumline after a parade. Echoes, then birds. The next morning, APS closed the case with a note that the order had been sufficient and the situation stabilized. Stabilized is a bureaucratic word for we got as close to justice as the forms allow. I filed the letter. I cried a little in my kitchen, the small, quiet kind you do while the kettle boils. Nola came by with muffins and the knowledge that muffins are better than speeches. Trent filed for divorce that afternoon. He didn't gloat. He didn't sag. He breathed. We made gumbo and let the house smell like every South End kitchen that ever saved a family one bowl at a time. I watched my son eat seconds. Revenge, I realized again, looks like nourishment when you do it right. Still, the trap had one more spring. A package arrived at my door with no return address. Inside, the unmarked vial, cleaned, stoppered, empty. A note, "Keep your trophies." I held the glass up to the window and watched the light go through it. Then I put it in a bag, labeled it, and slid it into the back of the freezer with the others. Not a trophy, a reminder that love without respect is a form of slow poison, and my house has alarms now. Tomorrow, lawyers would exchange drafts. Tomorrow, the story would leave our kitchen and move to rooms where strangers turn lives into pages. I would let it go. I would hold what stays. My son's laugh, my own quiet. The ledger that taught me revenge isn't payback. It's protection written in a language the world can't ignore. After doesn't look like you think. It looks like grocery lists with fruit again. It looks like Trent texting me pictures of the lake at sunrise and a screenshot of a calendar with therapy appointments colored in like stained glass. It looks like me sleeping through the night and waking without my jaw clenched. It looks like Risa's name not lighting my phone for days, then weeks. The legal machinery churned. Drafts became agreements. Agreements became orders. There were lines about property and pets and pensions that didn't belong to our kitchen story, but they matter in the rooms where people split their lives. I signed an affidavit when asked. I attended one more hearing where my name was said into a microphone and didn't sound like an accusation anymore. APS archived the file. The doctor sent a last note. Lab's normal. I wrote those 2 words on an index card and tucked it into my Bible next to Psalm 23. Not because I'm holy, because I'm grateful. Nola and I took a walk down by the water where the city pretends it's quieter than it is. She told me about a patient who stopped taking a supplement stack and started laughing again. I told her about the way silence in my house has changed from tense to tender. We didn't talk about Risa, not because she's a taboo, but because sometimes not naming a thing is how you stop feeding it. Trent came by for dinner with a new light behind his eyes that didn't look like new love. It looked like the kind you give yourself. I'm learning to eat because I'm hungry, not because someone scheduled it. He said, we both laughed at how small and seismic that sounded. He asked me if I was okay. I told him the truth. I'm learning to unclench. I'm learning that revenge took me only as far as protection. Repair is where we live now. That night, while washing dishes, I thought about the ledger. I had carried it like a family heirloom, my mother's way of keeping us alive in a world that forgets we are soft under our loud. I realized I could put it down sometimes. I could let the balance sit at 0 without checking it every hour. The kitchen window reflected a woman with lines ironed and a jaw finally loose. I said thank you out loud to no one in particular and meant it. Tomorrow is Trent's follow-up. Tomorrow is also the day the agreement becomes final. Tomorrow, I might take myself to the movies in the middle of the day and buy popcorn with too much butter and sit in the dark and watch someone else's story for 2 hours. Hooks have to let go sometime. Otherwise, they rust in your hand. We stood on the shore at Seward Park while morning made a mirror of the lake. Trent stretched like a man trying on his own skin and found it fit. I thought revenge would feel like fireworks. He said, "It feels like a door I finally closed." I smiled. Fireworks are for crowds. Doors are for homes. He nodded and slipped an arm around my shoulders, a weight I have loved since he learned to stand. The agreement finalized without spectacle. There were no handcuffs in our story, no perp walks, no villain speechifying in the rain. There was only a woman who liked control more than love, a man who learned to choose himself, a mother who turned her fury into forms that saved a life without ending another. Realism isn't glamorous. It's groceries and court orders and stew simmering while you scan PDFs. It's a South End kitchen, holding more power than it looks like because it knows how to turn harm into hunger met. I cleaned my freezer. I boxed the labeled bags and took them to a place that stores evidence better than a mother's kitchen. I kept the index card that said, "Lab's normal." I kept the kettle, not as a trophy, as a reminder that care can boil you if you're not watching. I bought a new one for Trent in a ridiculous shade of blue. He laughed and said it looked like a cartoon. We made tea with nothing in it but leaves and water and time. In the afternoon, I sat at my table and opened the ledger one last time. I wrote, "Debt paid," to the part of me that thought love equals control. "Mercy given," to the part of her that feared noise more than she feared harm. Balance, 0. Then I closed the book and put it on a shelf. If I need it again, I'll take it down. But for now, the house is quiet in the right way. The kettle sings, and it means nothing but heat. People will ask me later if I regret anything. I will say I regret waiting as long as I did to trust what my body knew. I will say I don't regret being loud when the world wanted me silent. I will say revenge is a word that people misunderstand. It is an eye for eye. It's removing the hand from the throat. It's paperwork and patience and a love that refuses to be managed into a smallness that looks like safety. It's a black mother in Seattle who refused to be cast as noise and instead became a metronome, steady until a son found his rhythm again. And if you ask for a hook, something to drag you into the next story, I'll tell you this. Once you learn the sound of your own kettle, you can hear when another house is screaming. Don't ignore it. Knock on their door. Bring cake. Open cabinets. Ask questions. Keep your ledger clean. The world is loud. Be louder, precisely.